The protests in Colombia are free speech, and stopping them is a violation of the First Amendment, is one of the weird things you hear by people who, on at every other moment in time, are against free speech or against the First Amendment, but they think that they're right to express their view without government stopping them or preventing them from doing so extends to blocking public areas or harming property or intimidating other people. So what exactly is this so-called right to protest? How does it fit within the First Amendment? Is it actually a thing? Do people have some sort of a right, a constitutionally protected in the U.S. right to protest, and if so, in what form? Welcome to the reality show, day 203 of the war in Israel. I'm joined by Morgan and Jonathan. I think we should go straight to Jonathan because Jonathan is in the US, moments from Colombia, depending on your mode of transportation. He's in Chicago, so you need a really fast mode of transportation. But you've seen your share of protests in
Yeah.
Chicago as well.
Well, and I'm 20 minutes from Northwestern University, which is my alma mater, which there's this similar type of, mass student protests, conflicts with police, kind of move-ins and sit-ins in various buildings and on properties. So I'm glad that we're talking about this today, gentlemen, and I'm glad our audience is joining us for today because, this is one thing in which Miss Rand actually did speak explicitly. And this was a phenomenon already in the late 1960s and early 1970s when she talked about this and was asked about this. So, I'm happy to get into it because, it reminds me very much of something that we talked about even before the war started, with that same type of protest that's so often undertaken by the environmentalists, right? The so-called environmentalists, whereas, they'll go, much as the pro Hamas contingent have, they'll go and literally go shut down traffic, take over an entire street. And it's happened in Chicago over and over again for weeks now, where just entire streets are completely shut down. No traffic can get by one way or the other. And, there's kind of example over this. And there was one day, even in the last, I think, week or so, where whether it be the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco or in Manhattan, all these key points were choked by pro-Hamas, I would say pro-terrorist protesters. And it's funny, as you said, Razi, I mean, I think if you would talk to these people, I don't think they're all necessarily young people. I think there's probably some not so young among them. They would be saying that they're just enacting their right to free speech, right? But Miss Rand wrote about free speech, and it does not, and I'm paraphrasing her words now, it certainly doesn't mean not only the right to be heard, but it certainly doesn't mean the right to shut down traffic to force other people to hear your view.
Yeah, Kathleen, I see, says in the chat that she just ordered a bunch of Rand's nonfiction, including Return of the Primitive, which is very relevant to this. She also, I saw that she also shared, she's a YouTube member, so she shared a Jonathan emoji, which is one of the perks you get as YouTube members. And she comments on the stubble. There is no stubble in that emoji, but the more members we have, the more emojis we can have, and maybe we'll have one with stubble. Back to the topic, Morgan.
Yeah, I think there's important issues to tease apart because I think lots of people who are probably well-intentioned around free speech do end up kind of confused because a lot of people, again, a lot of people who are well-intentioned are a bit confused on this, and also because there are, I think, genuinely moral and worthy movements which have used tactics like this in the past, and also because there are immoral movements, let's say, which have used more proper means of protest. And so it's not always the most clear issue. And I agree that The Return of the Primitive, I think, has Rand's essay or the typing up of a radio talk which is called Cashing in the Student Rebellion, which has a lot of discussion about this, which is very good. I think if you want to see where the problem comes in with these kind of mass protests, the kind of protests Jonathan was just showing, if you think about the kind of protests that Just Stop Oil engage in London and probably elsewhere in the world as well, where they'll sit across a road or they'll walk at an incredibly slow speed and stop people getting through. Often what you'll kind of see, especially when the police don't then remove them so that people can go on their way, is you'll see people who are understandably very frustrated. They just have to go on with their day, or in some cases, there's an ambulance which needs to get to a hospital. Private individuals will come up and attack them to drag them away from the road and so on. And that is just really a kind of breakdown into anarchy within your society. Because although people don't think that the people who are just standing in the road are using force, because it perhaps is just slightly less evident because they're not swinging punches or anything, they are forcibly stopping people from being able to do what is perfectly just for them to be able to do, which is to go through the public thoroughfare. So there's force being used in these mass protests, in these kind of clear examples we're talking about. And it's very important that the police are empowered and understand that there is no right to do this, and that to the extent that they allow these protesters to do it, they actually encourage the breakdown of law and order and allow a degeneration into violence. There was even a case in the UK with Just Stop Oil where the police officer was making sure the protesters were all okay. Does everyone have water? And that's actually the police being inverted from their proper role of stopping force being used and actually supporting people who are initiating it.
Yeah, I mean, seeing those people blocking a bridge and the police standing there and not doing anything. Now that was a picture. It could have been that they were just about to do something, but there are plenty of examples where they actually don't. I think part of it derives from this general misunderstanding of what rights are. And there is a Rand quote, I don't remember it off the top of my head, something about the rights of one person can involve the violation of the rights of somebody else. It's much better written by Rand than just said like that by me. But yeah, when we don't understand that, when we think, if somebody is better off than somebody else, and that the somebody else has a right to the better off person's property, there are many issues on which we don't really have an understanding of what rights are, and it does trickle down to different examples, like this example of your right to express your view can force me to listen, and force me to listen when I'm actually on my way somewhere and you are stopping me by force.
But of course they say, oh, it's the public streets. And I think I probably, I don't want to say I'd speak for Miss Rand, but the idea of public ownership of streets is anathema, I believe, to objectivism. But Miss Rand covered this in particular. And after you got done listening to this video, go check out a video from the Ayn Rand Institute, which is Ayn Rand in her own words, why there is no right to mass protest. And she talks about it, exactly this with regard to, clogging the public streets. And there's a lot, Morgan, you mentioned, there's a lot of great quotes from Ms. Rand on this particular topic. She says, the forcible occupation of another man's property or the obstruction of a public thoroughfare is so blatant a violation of rights that an attempt to justify it becomes an abrogation of morality. Absolutely. I mean, how outrageous. Can you imagine? I mean, forget if you're in a ambulance trying to get to the hospital having a heart attack or something, but even if you're trying to get to work or go pick up your kids and you got these just say oil fucks or these pro-Palestinian people, they're sitting down blocking the public road, go do it on your own property, on your own YouTube channel. Go rent a hallway, go rent a stadium and have your own rally and do that type of thing. But to disrupt people on a public thoroughfare, again, as Ms. Rand said, to put that forward as free speech is a joke.
Morgan.
Yes, and so that one of the kind of examples we were talking about just before we went live of a group who are disgusting, but who did this in a proper way. Jonathan was talking about the American Nazi Party or something, who in the 30s rented out Madison Square Garden to hold a rally. And although their cause is detestable, that's a much more proper way to do that kind of thing, because they weren't violating the rights of others, even if their ideas involved that. There you go. Got a little image of that there. And then on the inverse, a movement which I thought was very good, but used some of these mass protest means were the Chartist movement in the 19th century in the UK, who were advocating for parliamentary reform and who I think were very, very good, but who went out and staged what they called monster meetings, which were mass protest gatherings. And so even in examples of movements which are good, they can still use improper means. And it's very important to keep in mind that the ends don't justify the means. To the extent that you're stopping other people from going about their daily lives, you've given up on the means of peaceful communication. And I think that's what these students at Columbia and wherever else, or Just Stop Oil, actually tacitly admit a lot of the time. Because if you're peacefully communicating with someone, the person has the option of just going on their way and not listening to you. And they want to force them to listen. They don't want them to have the option of turning away and not listening. And that is just a naked admission that what you're doing is forceful, even though Just Stop Oil on Twitter all the time will say that their activists are being peaceful and nonviolent constantly, except that isn't what they are.
Yeah, the nonviolent claim. I mean, I've seen them wearing T-shirts saying nonviolent while they're, smashing windows, and the media plays along with that and repeats those lies. By the way, that Nazi rally, I'm guessing that's what inspired that great Seinfeld episode where they land at the airport and they decide to pretend to be somebody else to get the limo that limo driver was holding, and then they end up being it ended up that they pretended to be a Nazi on his way to speak at Madison Square Garden, and it's a funny episode. It's a great show. You should watch it. Jonathan, the point about in a free country, in the type of society that we're advocating for in laissez-faire capitalism, roads would be privately owned. But but while we get there, while we're on our way there, you can't have government saying, okay, these roads, we're running the roads, but we're going to allow people to violate your right. In a free country, you own a road, you can say, look, we have some Nazis protesting here, so get another, find another way, and then people will consider whether they want to do business with you.
And no tolerance, this is my belief, no tolerance for mobs. Rand wrote about mobs in Cashing in the Student Rebellion, which Morgan mentioned. The only power of a mob as against an individual is great muscular strength. And that's what all these groups are. They're just big mobs that go clog up and go screw up something that we're trying to do. A society that tolerates intimidation as a means of settling disputes, the physical intimidation of some men or groups by others, loses its moral right to exist as a social system, and its collapse does not take long to follow. And if this is I always felt like this a little bit about, now Nikos isn't here to defend Greece, but about what I've always seen in Greece. It seems like every 6 weeks in Greece, there's some type of protest that literally shuts down the streets and they block the streets. I always think that is the disintegration of, truly law and order. So just, what I find so frustrating, Morgan and Razi, is that these protesters, of course, they think that they're morally right. So they see disrupting, an ambulance trying to get to the hospital, or kids trying to get to school, or an adult trying to get to work. They see disrupting that as the moral exercise of their freedom of speech. They're wrong on every level. It's immoral what they're supporting, and it's immoral to practice free speech by interrupting everyone else's day or drive or anything else.
Yeah, Greece is a great example because, they have this amazing history of reason, and you have to go back more than 2,000 years. And if anybody here has been to Greece recently, they haven't made much progress in over 2,000 years because they kind of abandoned it pretty quickly. And maybe I'm a little bit unfair, but I'm not a fan. And Nikos doesn't watch the show, so I can say this kind of stuff. But anyway, I may have had.
And you had highlighted this as another great line of Rand's. You don't see advocates of reason and science clogging a street in the belief that using their bodies to stop traffic will solve any problems. I mean, that's so, frankly, I think we're the best example. I mean, we're doing thousands and thousands of hours of peeling people's mind, trying to get the way they think, not just piss them off by setting up a blockade in front of where they're trying to get to work.
Yeah, the missing link, by the way, is that the fourth? What page was that? I think it's the fourth essay in the.
Page 43 in Philosophy Who Needs It.
Yeah, so I think that means it's the fourth essay, the one that's after the metaphysical versus the man-made. Very, very good essay. Yeah, somebody in the chat, Willful Thinker, mentioned that the name of the Nazi that Seinfeld and Costanza pretended to be was O'Brien. Daniel mentioned here in the Zoom chat that this is a ploy by me to get people to watch Seinfeld. Everything I do is a ploy to get everybody to watch Seinfeld. But anyway, let's carry on. Morgan.
I've tried to watch Seinfeld, but it's no good, I'm afraid. Look, in the previous quote that Jonathan brought up, there's a line by Rand there, which I think is really good, where she's talking about the purpose of mass protest or mass civil disobedience, I think is how she puts it, is intimidation. And I would probably want to distinguish mass civil disobedience. Yes, there you go. From mass protest a little bit. Because, for example, one of the things in the context at the time, which I think Rand does deal with, is the civil rights movement. And in the kinds of civil disobedience that they were engaging in, they weren't trying to intimidate people. I don't think Rand has them in mind when she's talking about this here. She's talking about the hippies, for example. But when they were engaging in civil disobedience, they were showing they had a moral perspective of what their rights were. And they were demonstrating that they were being deprived of them in the segregated areas, and they were being attacked. And so it was kind of a provocation of an unjust law. Now, that isn't what the protesters in the current examples that we're thinking of are doing. And very much, if you think about the protesters on the Columbia campus, again, it is intimidation that they want to do. They want to intimidate the Zionists or the Jewish students on their campus. They want to intimidate the society at large to go along with their view to support Palestine. And they don't want to convince you of it by peaceable means. So I think Rand's right in saying that that's what they want. And then again, just to tease apart some of the more nuanced examples. In recent years, we saw protests in Iran, mass protests against the sort of brutal assault and killing, ultimately, of Mahsa Amini. Now, that's an example where I think a mass protest is completely proper, because the legal system there is inherently violent. The government there poses as an agent of law and order, but actually will execute violence on its own populace at whim, as in the case of Mahsa Amini, where, if I remember it right, they dragged her into a van for a couple of hours and just beat her up until she died of her wounds. So in that case, that's completely right, because there are no rights in Iran which are worth speaking of, which are being respected by that government. So that's a much better example. I think you can also talk a little bit about Hong Kong, or, all of in an authoritarian state. I think the context is very different from the context we're talking about of these protests going on in Western society. So for anyone who had it twigging in their minds, what about these examples of mass protest? I think there's a fair distinction to be made.
Yeah, I mean, I'd go beyond that and say, if you're living under tyranny, it's not just that you can protest, with signs and chants. You can actually use violence against your government, and should use violence against your government to overthrow them. I also, I'm going to get later into a type of protest that I support in a non-tyrannical country. But back to the Nazi protest in Madison Square Garden. So there's obviously, you rent private property, you can say whatever you want there. But even that, I would say that was right in 1939, when the U.S. was not yet at war with Nazi Germany and, had diplomatic relations and everything. Once you're at war with a country, you cannot advocate for that enemy. And this is another problem here in the West. First of all, these protests are not peaceful and are not respectful of property. Second of all, they are advocating for a country or an organization that should be considered enemies. And if we declare them as enemies, you cannot do that, and you shouldn't be able to do that, because then you are giving aid and comfort to the enemy, which should be a crime, that crime being treason.
Yeah, I remember Dr. Peikoff once had a great line, I'll paraphrase, whereas he said something to the effect that he thought the environmental movement was something that the hippies came up with after Vietnam, as their next cause du jour. And and maybe now that's what the Palestinian pro-Palestinian issue is. And it's what's so sad, Morgan, is that I think a lot of these young people, especially, do equate it. They equate their protest to that of something that I would consider a moral protest, like Rosa Parks in the civil rights movement. You know, Rosa Parks wasn't blocking anyone else's seat. She wasn't blocking the road. She was saying, treat me exactly as I am, like any other human being. I'm just treat me just as any with a right to sit on any seat in this public bus. That is, I think, a legitimate protest. She wasn't infringing on anyone else's rights, nor was, for example, the Cordaires, you know, who we profiled. And the Cordaires are objectivists who run a gallery out on the west coast of America that even when I believe the state said you have to shut down your private property for COVID, they said, we're not shutting our gallery down. We're opening our gallery. And, you know, that's not at all what these pro-Palestinian protesters are doing at all. They are clogging the streets. They are interfering with other people's rights to their life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the fact, I think, even their little pea-brain college minds, they think that what they're doing is just. It's not. May I read we've had a couple of great super chats, Razi.
I just want to make a quick point about Pen Cordaire Fine Art. Yeah, what they did is the exact opposite. They said, this is our property, so we're opening it. They didn't say, you know, you people who want to self-isolate and wear masks and whatever in your own home, you do it. This is our property. We're opening it. We're only opening it to the people who actually want to come in. If you don't want to go there, if you're afraid, if for whatever reason, you don't have to be there. So, yeah.
I mean, what is Rand's great quote about, you know, there's no conflict among rational men. You know, your exercise of your freedom of speech does not, with rational people, does not interfere with anyone else's rights. But these people are turning that very notion on their head. They believe that they have a right to stand in the middle of the street and block it or set up tent cities on other people's property. They don't.
Yeah. By the way, if one of the things you were going to read was Apollo Zeus agreeing with Morgan about Seinfeld, Apollo Zeus, I think, is just trying to trigger me, which he always does very well. So well done. Worked again. Yeah. But if you want to read anything else, go ahead.
Well, yeah, we've got a lot of very generous super chatters. Lauracento said, extremist action undertaken under the so-called right to protest. Is this the normalization of deviance? Deviance. What do you think?
Morgan, I see that you have an answer.
Well, I was just going to say, I think deviance is a too broad term, because people use deviance in a sense of people who are, you know, diverting from a moral norm in some way. But it certainly, the way that protests have been treated in the Western world, let's say since post-World War II, has meant that as a kind of precedent, people, although I don't know if there's actually actually, no, there will be a legal protection protest. But since these groups have been allowed to protest, and Rand speaks about the Nazis being allowed to protest in Skokie, Illinois, since they've been allowed, since all the hippies and all these other people have been allowed to do that, then you can't selectively apply this to just groups that you don't like. And you need to come up with a way that's objective, that you can universally apply it. Now, I think ultimately, if you have a right to protest, you can't do that. And I've got something else to say about that. But once you've let some people do it, you can't then just be selective. You have to let all of them do it. And so therefore it normalizes the idea that you go on protests. And therefore we see in the Western world a huge number of protests that there just weren't in the past. And it's become also the normal means of going about trying to achieve political change rather than the democratic process. I remember being at school learning about politics, and the idea of going on marches and protests was just part of the curriculum. You know, this is one means which you can pursue. And so I agree that it has become normalized.
Kathleen, thank you for your contribution, asks, is it wrong to move protesters out of your way if the police won't do it? Should you stick up for yourself and your rights in that situation? I mean, my God, I have such empathy for these, like motorists, for example, where they're riding along and all of a sudden there's these, protesters. I mean, if you were having a heart attack on the way to the hospital, if you had someplace to go, if your kid was waiting for you to pick them up. I mean, well, Razi, what would you do? I mean, my God, of course, then you open yourself up to your own liability if you pull someone out of the way. But Morgan, as you said, I mean, this is when the police justifiably have the monopoly on the use of force. And when they abdicate on it, when they don't use it, then it's anarchy. It's every man and woman for him and herself.
Yeah, longtime viewers of this channel will maybe remember that for October 7th, we talked about other things like the Just Stop Oil protests. And I remember in one of them saying, I think it was with Mark, and I said to Mark, you and I disagree about MMA. I'm not a fan. I don't like the idea of putting two people in a cage and having them beat the shit out of each other until one of them can't get up. I don't see that as entertainment. But when I see those videos of drivers getting out of their cars, moving those hippies by force from the road, I enjoyed that. Is it in terms of like should you do it? There's different questions. Yeah, you are putting yourself at risk legally, but you are protecting yourself from violence. The initiator of violence is the person who stands in your way and doesn't let you go through. Yeah, Jonathan.
Well, here's Miss Rand's words. You do not have the right to parade through the public streets or to obstruct public thoroughfare. You have the right of assembly, yes, on your own property and on the property of adherents of your friends. But no one has the right to clog the streets. Miss Rand said this in 1978. Just when, ironically, so many of these professors now were teaching these little pro-Palestinian, militia members were being born. They were being born, and again, Miss Rand, I hate to use the term prophetic because it kind of suggests mysticism, but she saw all of this being, brewing in the 60s and 70s, and she warned us about it. Now it's playing itself out on college campuses all over America and Europe as well.
Yeah, well, it's the prophecy of understanding the power of ideas, which Rand understood better than anyone. Thank you, Gail, for the super chat. Morgan?
I think, as we've kind of been implying or talking about, the police are far too permissible about this kind of thing. And although there have been some arrests on the Columbia campus and on some of these current protests that are going on, probably nowhere near enough. But certainly in these other examples, like the eco protesters, Just Stop Oil, although occasionally I've seen some videos of the police try and drag them out of the streets, by and large, they let them do it. And again, they even encourage them in certain circumstances. And so I think there's two factors here. One, if you're going to go drag them out of the road, you are putting yourself at risk because you'll probably get the law coming back on you. However, I think morally, you're entirely justified in doing it. Were the police to be doing their job properly and to come and remove them, then I think we could probably say, no, you shouldn't go and remove them. You should wait for the police. However, given that they've abdicated that responsibility, I don't know what else you can do, to be honest. Like if you try and inch around them with your car, they'll just shift in front of you. Like it's just a completely impossible situation. So I think it's very understandable when you see, there was one video I remember seeing of a mother who was just trying to take her kid to school, and she like grabbed one of them by the scruff of their neck. And as soon as she grabs them, the lady starts screaming, whatever. So I have a lot of sympathy with that lady. On the other hand,
I'm sorry, Morgan, please.
Okay. On the other hand, I do appreciate that to some extent the police are put in a bit of an impossible situation, because if there's legal protections on them doing protests, the police who are sympathetic, they're completely in the wrong. But if someone has a protected right to protest and therefore, in a sense, a protected right to violate other people's rights, then how do you negotiate that in the situation on the ground? There is just no way to do it. And we've covered some examples in the UK recently, like the one with Gideon Falter, where the police, I think, were absolutely in the wrong for what they were doing. But I appreciate that they were trying to be as reasonable in the circumstances as they could be, given the impossible negotiations they would have to do. And so that's why, people have seen that they were trying to be kind of, negotiate things as best they could. And they've said, oh, Gideon Falter was just looking to create an issue. But I don't think that's the right way to think about it at all. I think that the mob that marches through London on Saturdays is violent, and that's why the police were having to be worried about Gideon Falter walking through the streets. And if you're violent, you have no protected right to go and walk through the streets at all. And actually, what the police should be doing is shutting you down. However, the legal system and the public sentiment has created a conflict that they just can't negotiate. So there are some situations where I understand why it's difficult for the police.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would love to see, at least when I was in college, when I was at Northwestern, I loved hearing radical views. And to me, it was exciting to hear people come in and give a speech that I completely didn't agree with. And there was something really exciting about universities being exactly that, a place for discussion. But when you use your body like a weapon, when you're starting to go block people from being able to move, block students from being able to be safe, I mean, that's when force starts and reason stops. I mean, Dr. Peikoff had that very casual line from so many years ago. It's like something effective. There's two ways of dealing with people, by force or by reason. And the minute you stop just talking about it and start using your body as force, as you said, Morgan, happens throughout, whether it be with the environmental movement or now with this. And what I hate to see is that it's celebrated on campuses now. I mean, these young people think that they are the moral ones because they're suddenly they're not going to class anymore, and they're going and having I don't even think they're protests. When you are blocking traffic, when you are blocking a public thoroughfare, when you are intimidating students, Jewish or otherwise, from literally going to class, that's not protests. That's force in the most ugly of fashions.
One of the protests I remember from, I think it was Extinction Rebellion. I'm pretty sure it was them who, they would do this thing where for 2 weeks they would go to different places around London and block different parts of it. And one day they went to Canning Town Station, tube station in East London. And leftists leftists are not all the same. There are different types of leftists. There are these the leftists who are probably youngish from well-off backgrounds. Extinction Rebellion, I think, are very much along those lines. And then there are people who are kind of unionists. They want the government to protect their job or whatever, but they just want to go to work and do their thing. And this is pretty much what Canning Town is. So the protest there was some of them got on top of the trains. The trains stopped at the station. They got on top. Obviously, the train can't move. And this is like at rush hour, the morning rush hour. The platform is full, and people are very upset. And then there's a video of somebody actually going up, pulling one of them down, and the crowd is cheering. And you see how these people probably thought they would have the sympathy of people in East London, who I'm sure vote Labour and so on. But yeah, this was dubbed the Battle of Canning Town, I think, by Brendan O'Neill of Spiked, friend of this channel. It was one of those moments where I would like to see more of that. I would like to see less of these protests, obviously, but ideally, if they do happen, I would like to see people stand up to them a bit more. Should we go to Christian's super chat?
Please.
Thank you, Christian, for the super chat. Christian says, today, a leftist politician wrote me a private message to claim I was in favor of apartheid and I'd hate poor people and I was an accountant for Jewish diamond traders. I made screenshots to share. Well, is this a politician? Christian, you're in Luxembourg, right? I always forget these things, but yeah, that would be interesting. Not surprising because these people are so the pro-Palestinian side lives off of slogans. You see so many comments. If you go through any video that we've done and you go to the ones with more views, they obviously have more comments, and you scroll through and you look for the ones that disagree with us. They say things like you're supporting genocide or you're apologists for genocide. They don't actually have arguments because for arguments you have to think. And if you're a thinking person, eventually you will not support the Palestinian cause. But yeah, I'm sorry, Christian, that you experienced that, but I'm not surprised.
It reminds me a little bit, and I will share this of the great, when Rand was asked, I know you both remember that exact, same, I don't even think it's a question, what do you say when, you say you hate the poor, right? I mean, how do you respond to the accusations that you hate the poor? Can I quickly share her answer, Razi?
I hope the Ayn Rand Institute won't sue us for this, but yes.
Her answer of why.
Question is, what do you reply when someone says to you, you hate the poor and disadvantaged, don't you?
Nobody has ever come close enough to me to say such a thing.
Nobody's ever come close enough to me to say such a thing. I love that. Well, such a great response, But it's just that unbelievable straw man that we see being trotted out once again. And I'm just glad to see objectivists, appealing to reason. Bonnie alluded to the fact, this is the same thing, force versus reason. I'd like to think that we are always, referring to reason to make our case and not force. Again, Ms. Rand's comments, you don't see, scientists out there, blocking the streets with their bodies. And, I don't think you ever, I think if you're getting thrown in a police cruiser, in my opinion, 9 times out of 10, you're doing it wrong. If you are violating people's rights in order to make your case, you're doing it wrong. This is my 2 cents.
Morgan, you want to jump in, and then I'll give my story of the protest that I support.
Well, I was just gonna, on Christian's comment about him saying that he hates the poor and whatever, there's, it's unfortunately common for politicians, especially politicians, since they're so active in the political world, to parody their opponents. There was an appearance by a British Labour politician called Angela Rayner on a podcast a few months ago, and one of the hosts used to be a Conservative politician, and he asked her, I sometimes feel like people from the Labour Party kind of lampoon or caricature someone like me. So what do you earnestly think a conservative, moderate conservative like me, like what are my deeply held values and views in the world? And she sort of like spluttered and ummed and ahed because she couldn't come up with something. And she eventually said, I think you care deeply about animal rights. And that was the first thing she could come up with, as if conservatives, the first like deeply held value they have is protections for animals. And basically, I think because although this itself sounds like a caricature, can't say that word. I think for too many of them, particularly on the left, but this does happen on the right, a left-wing politician in the Labour Party will go to work in the morning and think, the Conservatives, if she's imagining their day, they just want to plan how they can kill the poor, and they just really hate them, and it's just as ridiculous as that. So I wouldn't put any stock in that, Christine.
And sadly, the Conservatives in this country, it looks like all they think about when they wake up in the morning is how can we be more like Labour. So at least, yeah, those in power. So I've said this in the past, but in Israel there are protests nowadays. There are the protests you hear about in mainstream media in Israel, which is the protests where they are blocking the roads, demanding of the Israeli government that they release the hostages by agreeing to whatever deal Hamas puts on the table. And of course, Hamas always changes the deal because they see Israel agreeing to whatever deal they put on the table. So that's one form of protest that the ideas match the form of the protest. They are ideas that involve capitulating to violence, and they use violence to demand that capitulation. There are also the protests. I don't know if they're still going on, but the people, including some members of family, some relatives of hostages, who, when Israel was letting, or when Israel is still letting in, but Israel was letting in so-called humanitarian aid, and they went there and they blocked those trucks from getting in because they said if they want aid, they should release the hostages. What you are doing is feeding to use the word of the wording of these protesters in Colombia, you are feeding the war machine. You are feeding the Palestinian war machine, the war machine that is holding and abusing and torturing these hostages, the war machine that keeps, to this day, over 6 months after October 7th, keeps firing rockets into Israel, that is still killing Israeli soldiers, and is we don't know what is being planned for Israel and Rafah, but it's not going to be good. You are feeding that machine, and we are going to protest against it. This is the kind of thing that if a free country gets to that point, they're not blocking the roads for any any people on their way from point A to point B. They are blocking the trucks that are going in to feed the people who just want to kill Jews. That is a good type of protest, and of course, that is the type of protest that is often criticized as well.
Yeah, I just think it's a great opportunity to kind of get back to basics. And Rand wrote extensively about what exactly rights are, and a right is, I'm paraphrasing now, I think this was Dr. Peikoff's line, a right is a right to act. It's not a freebie from someone else. You do not have a right to go interfere with people's businesses, to interfere with people's travel, to block the roads. You have a right to your own voice. Open up your own YouTube, or not even YouTube channel, open up your own apartment, and invite people in and have what other type of rallies, or rent out a hall and do just that. But I think that's what's so frustrating now is that the moral high ground seems to be with these young people and other people who block the roads, or at least when this is a number of years ago. Do you guys happen to remember the Occupy Wall Street protests?
Yeah.
So this was, I don't even forget what year was that. Was that 2008? Back then you had the leftists that were sleeping in the public parks. They weren't even public. If you want to talk about Zuccotti Park, was a private park, but they just camped out, and they seemingly thought they had the moral high ground against some evil Wall Streeters. And here we are, just once again, not acting in terms of reason, but acting in terms of force, and thinking that that's the way you can get people to agree. Can I read the super chat from Equal to Reality? Equal to Reality writes, their quote, their reaction is your real action, quoting James Lindsay. This means that leftists want the reaction of their enemy to make leftists look like the good guy, I suppose, right? I mean, that's their money shot, right? They get handcuffed and tired, walked away from the environmental protest. Daryl Hannah is so strong that she's getting arrested for her views, or these people are so strong they're getting arrested for their views. Like, what a friggin' waste of actual legitimate police police resources. Forcing the police to kind of go waste their time with these illegitimate so-called rights.
Yeah, Mugiwara mentions says the 1%. Yeah, the 1% was the slogan. The 1% was Occupy Wall Street's equivalent of today's genocide. It's something that people would throw out there, and of course we can. This is not the topic for today, but the very idea that if you are in the 1%, you are somehow taking from other people who have never, in some cases, at least I think the people on Occupy Wall Street have never probably created anything of any worth, which is why they're in whatever percent that they are. But it's so often these movements that act violently while protesting for violence. You don't hear full arguments from them. You just hear these empty slogans, because again, these are not ideas that are thought through. Otherwise, they would not be held by these people.
Like, I can't think of much that I'm going to be persuaded by when it is preceded by the chant, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, that has got to go." That is, I would posit, not going to work on rational minds.
So you're saying a rhyme doesn't prove that the wording of it is true?
Is that a favorite on in Europe as well? Like, or do they have it as like is there a different way that they clog streets and annoy the hell out of everyone else.
I mean, some of the slogans, when it's the same cause, are the same. Occupy Wall Street, we had a London version of that. People copied that here and occupied the outside of St. Paul's Cathedral. And I remember going there one day, and yeah, I was not impressed. But they had the same 1% slogan.
Whose streets? Our streets. And isn't that the devil of public property? Because on some level, they're right. When it's publicly owned, it belongs to no one. There's no one owns it. So any mob can go get a big group and say it's our streets now. I mean, this is exactly the type of anarchy that I think objectivism rejects.
Yeah, just Chandler in the chat is trying to defend rhymes. Chandler, we will hear your defense of rhymes when you in your next rap song mention me, unlike the previous one where I didn't get a mention. Morgan.
I think if the people we're criticizing here heard the kind of explanation of what's wrong with mass protest and all this kind of stuff, because in a sense saying because you have the alternative of peacefully and rationally trying to change someone's mind and they're using force, I think they would bristle at that a little bit, because basically what they've been taught in the post-war academia is that all ideas are essentially arbitrary and are actually means of creating discourses which enforce systems of violence upon people. So all ideas really are just tools of violence. So because they reject the whole idea that rationality is peaceful per se, if we were to say, look, mass protests are means of intimidation, you have this peaceful means, why don't you use that? They would just reject that whole analysis. They would say you're constructing an artifice which just reinforces the status quo, which results in violence against Palestinians and oppressive capitalism and all that stuff. So unfortunately, they've got this whole construct in their mind, which is going to stop them even getting onto the level of that. And they will reject the idea that there is any peaceful option. And that's because there is as I think you were mentioning before, Jonathan, there's a kind of blurring, a conceptual blurring between peaceable, non-violent means and violent means. I remember just outside my door, there's a lamppost with a sticker on it, which is getting at the same thing. The sticker says, money is as innocent as the gun. And the point of that message is to say that money, which is a peaceful means of trading, is just as innocent as using force, i.e. there is no difference between them. And this is where an area of Rand's thought, which I think can seem a bit dry or abstruse to a lot of people, which is her epistemology, where she really focuses on keeping conceptual clarity in the forefront of how you're thinking, is very important, because what these guys are trading on is the idea of blurring the boundaries between a rational, peaceful means of trading or exchanging ideas and a violent means of intimidation. And unfortunately, these kind of ideas dominate in the academia today. And when we say that they've been taught these ideas by their professors and they're just putting them into action, that's really the cause and the result that we're seeing play out.
I find that so fascinating. If I could just say quickly, Morgan, because you sounds like we're in class. You studied philosophy. It sounds like probably in the last 10, 12, 15 years, and you've told stories of being instructed on exactly just that. Where do these young people learn this? Like, they learned it from their professors. Their professors are the ones, and it almost reminds me, that title you mentioned reminds me of an essay that I believe Dr. Binswanger wrote within the last 10 or 15 years, The Dollar or the Gun. The difference between, if you say, I'm not going to support Starbucks, they support Israeli genocide, okay? So I'm not going to go, as against, I'm going to go into Starbucks, spread paint all around and make a big ruckus. And that's my legitimate protest. It's not.
Yeah. By the way, I see there's a whole conversation about animal rights in the chat. I'm not sure about this, but we may have done at some point a show about animal rights. But I do think the idea of animal rights is a misunderstanding of what rights are. Of course, as I saw Christian say, that doesn't mean you go around abusing animals. But does the government, what do rights mean, and what does that mean in terms of where the government needs to step in to protect them? Of course, where do you? Oh, Daniel. Wow, that is quick. Okay, the Daily Objective, episode 533. Why is the taste of meat more important than an animal's life? That is the title of it. I don't know, Daniel, if you know who was on that, but that's
Well, and I'll just jump in. That exact question is addressed in Dr. Peikoff's book, Can You Really Love a Dog? You know, the so-called rights of animals. He illuminates this explicitly. So it's available on Amazon. Definitely check out our YouTube presentation, but check out Dr. Peikoff on that topic as well, I may say.
yeah. And Daniel put the link to that in the chat. The
while
people
we're
on that show were Mark Pellegrino, Amanda Maxim, and Jonathan Honig. That was an episode, a Thursday episode of the Daily Objective, which we used to call the Thursday Collective. We loved that show so much, we then turned it into its own daily show, the reality show. So in the last few minutes that we have left, I wanted to ask you guys, because Daniel and I spoke about it in the Daily Objective. Did you see the what happened in Emory University, how the protesters were dealt with there?
No.
Okay, Jonathan, have you seen it?
Did they turn the sprinklers on?
No, Daniel, actually, if you're able to share just that one video of the first one, the important one, I know people who have watched the Daily Objective will be watching this again. But check this out, because I think this is this pretty much says it all. And unfortunately, I see that it's once again in this very small screen. So look closely, people, and we'll share a link to the video in larger form. Go ahead.
Get on the ground, I said! Oh my God! You're a rabid dog! Oh my God! Give me some cops! You hit that trooper head! You just hit my head! On the concrete! Oh my God! Oh my God! You people are fascists! You are Hitler! You are a rabid dog! Shame on you! May you never live another day! I am a professor! This is an Emory professor, everyone! I am a professor of economics! You are rabid dogs! You are fascists!
It was a peaceful protest until they started fighting troopers. I agree with you.
L-I-N. I reacted impulsively. I apologize.
No, you're right. It's right to rebel. I'm gonna share this.
Please remove the handcuffs.
Okay, so because it was in such a small screen, let me explain. Somebody was being arrested. This professor of economics in Emory University came over, tried to see what was going on, then came very, very close to the point where you would rightfully, you'd be right in being concerned about what she's there to do. So a police officer pushed her away and then told her to get on the grass. She wouldn't, she refused. He said it repeatedly, and then he took her down. And then she started making these annoying noises, seeing if that would work, and complaining about her hand being on the concrete. And then she said repeatedly, "I'm a professor, I'm a professor." And then towards the end, she says, she apologized and she said, "I reacted impulsively. Please take off the handcuffs." Jonathan, your first thoughts on that?
Christian, who's not a YouTube member, I wish he was. Christian has a great line. He says, "I am a professor." And then the response should be, "Cuff this one harder. She's responsible for the whole mess." I think it's pretty applicable. I mean, pretty appropriate. I mean, these ideas are what are moving the world, and unfortunately moving it in exactly the wrong direction. And when a police officer asks you to do someone, look, they're the ones that we have given the use of force to. We have trusted them with the use of force. When they tell you to do something, do it.
Yeah, just quickly. So we have a link that you can watch later, hopefully, to the video on Twitter from some tweet where you can see it in a bigger screen. Clementine asks, I don't know what she did, but why would her being a professor matter? So you can see what she did closer in the. But yeah, why does it matter? Because she thinks that puts her somehow above the law. She thinks she can do something, and then when getting arrested, she has this immunity of being a professor. Morgan.
Yes, I agree that it's weird that she keeps crying out that she's a professor. She thinks she has some special status because of that. I mean, that whole video is rather distressing to watch, but I think as Jonathan said earlier, although perhaps it's not the primary intention of the marches, when they get broken up as they should be, they rely on these videos being shared and that playing on people's emotions, and they want that as well. I think the guy filming was saying that he's going to share it, and so, you know, they get some profit out of that as well.
You are Nazis. Like, come on. Go to the Holocaust Museum and learn about what the Nazis actually did before you believe that this everyday police officer making a pretty benign arrest is anything equivalent to anything that the Nazis did.
Yeah, if you go learn about, I'm forgetting her name, but is it Ava Scholl, the Scholl twins, who at the University of Berlin just shared some anti-Nazi pamphlets, didn't even stage a protest, and were murdered by the Nazi state. You can really learn how the Nazis treated student protests. And then to end on a lighter note, referring to the animal rights before, people may have seen that some horses from I think it's the Buckingham Palace cavalry the other day staged a mass protest and rampaged through the streets of London after they escaped their captivity, you know, but they don't have the right to protest either. So anyway, never mind.
Yeah, Clementine also says it's like a famous person saying, "Don't you know who I am?" And yeah, that's what I was thinking when I saw this. Like, I was wondering if I can use this, you know, if I'm in a line somewhere and there's a long line and I can just walk up and say, you know, I'm Razi Ginzberg from the Ayn Rand Center UK's YouTube channel. Let me through. And but no, professors actually believe in an actual situation where she's being arrested that this is a card she can pull. Well. I think that's all we have time for today. That's an interesting way to wrap it up. I said on the Daily Objective, go watch that if you haven't yet. I said this is my favorite. This is my favorite video from all these protests because it shows so clearly how detached from reality these people are, and yeah, we need to bring them back to earth, and hopefully law enforcement can help do that. Jonathan, where can people find more from you? Yeah.
Well, find the book by Dr. Peikoff, Can You Really Love a Dog? It's available at Amazon. Original work from Dr. P, the world's greatest living objectivist. So check it out. I know it's something you'll enjoy.
Morgan, where can people find more from you?
You can find me at Morgan Carter 98 on Twitter, which will be linked in the description, and you can find my soon-to-be relaunched Substack there as well.
I'm Razi Ginzberg on X. I'm also in the Hebrew podcast Yaldei Midrechov with my friend Naftali for people who speak Hebrew. And I believe I will be back here tomorrow. The Daily Objective is 7 days a week. The reality show is 6 days a week, 5 of them open to the public, 1 for YouTube members only. The reality show extra is on Sunday. Hopefully you can join us for that. Of course, if you become a YouTube member, you also have access to things like our Discord and emojis. There's the Jonathan emoji, which I believe there's also a t-shirt with that. I don't know if we're still selling it, but yeah, and more emojis to come soon. A Morgan emoji, I think, is well overdue. So
with hair or without hair, I don't know.
I think the most recent one is there a briefly objective today, Daniel? All right, then we'll be back tomorrow. Thanks, and see you tomorrow.